So let's take a look at our very first document, document 1. We have a sourcing line. The AP likes to put them either at the top or the bottom. That's where your teacher will generally put it. This has some basic information about the document. We have the author's name, Brieux. Am I saying that right, Dave?
You are. Yep, Brieux. Yep.
Brieux. And then a title of the document, Voyage à Inde et in Indochine.
Oh God!
Oh man, Dave, you want to do your French? You've got that.
Let me unleash my Canadian. Voyage
en
Indochine, simple note d'un touriste.
Right, and if you're taking this course in English, you'll probably have a translation, right? Trip to the Indies and Indochina. Some simple notes by a tourist. Yep. All right, so this tells us a couple things. It tells us the author's name. And it tells us that this is a tourist's account, right? If you've, and again, meeting students where they are, it would be a great opportunity to present them with, for example, a travel account of someone who's visiting your state or your city where your students are, right? A Yelp review of a restaurant that the students eat out at, right?
I like it. Yeah.
Just remind them that, like, hey, there are analogs to this document. That might be a nice way to get yourself warmed up in the first 5 or 10 minutes of class. And then sometimes they have a little more information. The following is an excerpt from a French traveler's account visiting Hanoi, Vietnam, right? So they tell us sometimes a little bit about the document that isn't in the document itself, but you would probably get reading before or after this section. And then here we have the text of the historical source itself. We can note that it's been translated from French to English. And let's read it off. We are, it is true, the masters in title, but the Chinese are the true masters. They are 200,000 and we are 10,000. We send soldiers and they send merchants. We administer the colony while they exploit it. Boom, there's our first source, Dave.
Well, I just want to let you know that the students would love this document because it's short. And that's just my interpretation. They're going to love this, right? And they're going to bomb it. They're going to do terrible on a document like this and say this is a document that they see in something like a DBQ question.
We've graded a million like these. Yeah.
And they're going to take a look at this and they're going to say, oh, really interesting. The French went to Vietnam and found that the Chinese run the colony.
Right.
And
they're going to focus in on this line right here, but the Chinese are the true masters.
Right. And this is one of those issues. It seems fairly simple if you're someone with a background in the long 19th century, because again, if you're someone who teaches the long 19th century, you'll know this is the era of European expansion. Right. European countries are sending out colonists, missionaries, soldiers, merchants. They're going all around the world, and they are extraordinarily successful at setting up colonies in remote locales, especially in places like, say, Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia. And so seeing a document like this, if you're a historian trained in the long 19th century, you're going to look at it and be like, the Chinese are the true masters. Got it. Yeah, sure. But for a student, because they may not necessarily be aware of that context, they might zero in on that and say, well, that's the message. And this is a French guy in Vietnam. He's been there. He's seeing this with his own eyes. From his
he was an eyewitness. Yeah, they're going to say from his point of view, or his bias was as a French traveler, he didn't like the Chinese, right? Or he was afraid of the Chinese, or he didn't, because he did. They might even say something like, because
he was racist.
He was racist, right? And they may even mention, like, social Darwinism or something like that. They're going to say, because he didn't like the Chinese, he was afraid of them, and the tone of the document is afraid, and he mentions the Chinese are the true masters. And while some of that has kernels of truth to it, it's not going to be enough, according to the AP standards, in order to get points for this sort of high-level analysis of sourcing a document.
Right, exactly. And to get to that high level, I mean, there's a number of things that we can pick out of this document that are really, really useful as we kind of guide students through approaching this. And I mean, one of the first things that I saw when I was reading this is Simple Notes d'un Touriste. And this issue of, okay, who is this guy? Who is Bria? And in this case, where we see he's writing as a tourist, as a traveler, as a visitor to Hanoi in 1910, that immediately sets off little alarm bells, because oftentimes tourists are going to be people who will visit for, say, a week, a couple of weeks. They're not going to be that familiar with the subtext of what they're seeing. Certainly, he's not going to be someone who we would expect to be familiar with a language like Chinese, so he probably wouldn't have necessarily been able to speak. Well, probably, I think even more certainly would not be aware of, you know, the undercurrents of what's going on in this colony, because the only people he would be able to speak to would be other French individuals. That would be the primary social circle he would probably surround himself with. And so this again suggests that if he's speaking about the Chinese as the true masters, well, where is he going to be getting this information, right?
Right. And so this is back to sort of our introduction, right? We want to talk about the sort of purpose of a document, right? And Dave has mentioned, right, it's a tourist account, right? It's supposed to be a travel account. And so from that, we know that tourists aren't people who live and breathe and, you know, spend lots of time in a place. And he even tells us in the title, right, these are basic notes, right? And from the title, we can also guess, right, voyage to the Indies, you know, and into China. Maybe he toured all of French Indochina. It's not a voyage specifically to Hanoi. And this brings it back to my earlier point as well, right? It's so important to meet yourself or to meet your students where you are, right? Look at some other documents, right? If you show students a Yelp account of their favorite restaurant of someone who went there one time, right, and had a bad experience, or, you know, a tourist account of coming to your city or state from someone who, you know, maybe spent a weekend there, right? They're going to know, hey, this person doesn't really know what this place is, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, I mean, there's a lot here that kind of suggests maybe the opposite, right? Certainly the Chinese, this guy indicates they are much more numerous than the French. There are a lot more people of Chinese ancestry in Hanoi than in people of French ancestry, which is obviously, I think, true. That's probably accurate. However, as we see here, we send soldiers and they send merchants. That's kind of getting at the key tension here, right? That, again, for the French, they may feel like they are sending these military units, but they're not getting as much economic gain from that as they would like. But that doesn't mean they're not getting economic benefits from colonization. That just means that maybe the French in the colony perceive that there is more competition than they would desire, which is an interesting point, as you say. But again, that's probably not how a student's going to interpret this document.
Right. But this is a way that we can build students up to be able to interpret a document like this, right? And we talked about, you know, sort of doing that. Dave notes this sort of key difference, right, between the Chinese and the French, right? Talking about soldiers versus merchants, right? Ask anyone, you know, who has the real power, right? You know, a bunch of, you know, businessmen or a dude with a gun, right? At the end of the day, right? Who has the actual power? Dudes with guns, right? So you can bring that up with students. But we talked about really doing this high-level sourcing analysis of a document, right? You've got to connect it to things that you already know or are kind of outside the document. And before we get into the history of the long 19th century and what students should know about that, let's just talk about a general takeaway that applies to pretty much all of human history, right? One of the big things in AP World History, and a theme as well a little bit in AP Euro and AP US history, is this idea of empire, right?
Right.
So
imperialism, yeah.
Imperialism, right? And whether it's, you know, and whether we're talking about, you know, the Romans or, you know, the United States of America or the British Empire or the French Empire or the Spanish in South America, right? One of the problems with imperialism is when you're on top, you're usually a little worried about being displaced, right? And there's always a lot of anxiety from imperial sources, wherever they come from, about usurpers, right? And maybe it's not an outright rebellion, but it's those little usurpations that show the cracks that we're not getting enough out of this, and these people aren't respecting us enough, and I don't think they're really truly learning the lessons of our empire that we want them to.
Cracks in the facade of imperialism. I love it, man. I love it. And that's such a critical point, right? Because this level of not exactly hysteria, but paranoia, I think, is a fairly accurate term. This is something that we see in a lot of documents from this period. I mean, Johannes Fabian has a great account of this sort of mental instability of Europeans, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, as a result of the type of medications they were taking, and sort of their sense of just being completely isolated where they were, and the impact of that again shapes a lot of the travelogues that we read from this very same time period that we're talking about here. So again, couldn't agree more. Love it.
I mean, and again, if you're looking for a place to meet those students, especially the ones who are struggling at the beginning of the year, to really think about, because a lot of the things we analyze in history classes, especially textual sources that are written, are from people in positions of power and authority. And one of the things that you can, to really get students to think about, a little dog, is to have them analyze a document from someone in power and authority in their life, probably from like a school administrator or a teacher, right? You don't want to embarrass anyone at your school or get yourself fired, but right, share a student's, there's always that speech from a principal or an assistant principal about the big problems in the lunchroom, or the fact that people are showing up late from lunch, and they make it seem like such a big deal and everything's collapsing, and it's never been this bad at our school in all our years. And your students will probably immediately recognize that this person, for whatever reasons they have, probably to sort of drive this home and to emphasize their own needed position as an administrator, that things aren't that bad, right? They're maybe overreacting a little bit. So again, my message is just always trying to find a way to meet students where they are. And so I think Dave and I have showed that with no specific information about this particular period, your students can begin to approach sourcing. But like really true sourcing, the sort of highest level that we're going to ask from students in high school, can't happen unless students can really contextualize a document in its proper historical place, right? Its time, its geography, and what else is going on. So as Dave and I have mentioned, date of this document 1910 in AP World History. This is from period 5. In all of history, it's from something historians call the long 19th century, at the very height of the age of imperialism, right? When European dominance before World War I is truly at its peak. And in places like Southeast Asia, Europeans, particularly the French, have conquered large swaths of territory. While they don't have huge numbers of French people on the ground, they have extreme military control. They've killed violently many people in rebellions, and you can say the same general thing for the United States in the Philippines, for European countries in Africa. The one place that Europeans in Asia have not conquered, right, and this is a big, broad understanding for world history, is China, right? But the one thing students should know about China is that it is under European economic dominance, right?
Oh, I thought you were going to say Japan there. Come on.
Okay, yeah. So Japan, right? Students should also know that Japan, right, has formed its own empire. Now, so this is all, if you're looking at your AP World History course guide from, I think, key concept like 5.3 or 5.2, European imperialism. The other key concept that applies here is, I think, key concept 5.4 about the migrations during the long 19th century, right? And
yeah, that's a really good point.
Include everything from, the continuation of the Atlantic slave trade to the migration of sort of indentured servants from China and India, but it also includes diasporic migrations, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
This includes European settlers and administrators in small numbers. This French person, as Dave has pointed out, is not a settler or an administrator. He's a visitor, but he had to get his sources because he's not a native from those French administrators and soldiers that lived in Vietnam. But the second more important one is the Chinese diaspora, right? And this is a continuation from periods 3 and even periods 4 and 3, so going back hundreds of years, right? In Southeast Asia, there's a Chinese diaspora of, we call them today expats, right? Living in Vietnam with connections back to southeastern China, where they have that facilitate trade from Vietnam to China and from China back to Vietnam.
Yeah.
So we've got these two main understandings, right, that we can apply to this document, right? And they're big ones. They're not specific ones, right? These are like in the top 20 things students need to know for this course, right? So again, it's not specific knowledge that you need to worry about. These are two of the 19 key concepts. One, European domination in the age of imperialism, including conquering Southeast Asia. Two, that the Chinese diaspora exists in Southeast Asia as a way to, facilitate trade. Okay, so now that we've identified, right, that these are the two sort of knowledges that students need, how can we use them to source this document, to analyze it at a high level? Like, what conclusions should a student draw?
So I would say what conclusions a student should draw from this document is, I think, first of all, that the individual writing this probably had limited information about what was going on in the colony, probably would not be able to figure out what the underlying sort of conspiracy was. So we should put that to the side, that probably the Chinese were not the true masters of this colony necessarily. I really think a really important point here is this issue of imperial paranoia, that a lot of settlers in Hanoi, even in 1910, were very aware that the other shoe could drop at any time, and that there was a visceral fear and suspicion of other people who had migrated to the colony who they perceived as rivals. However, that perception probably was not justified, that the French were in positions of very real power. We know that because we're talking about 1910. We know that because of the long 19th century. We know that because of the larger imperial context that this is coming from. But I think it provides valuable insight into the fears of the settlers. I think it provides valuable insight into the population migrations that were triggered by colonialism, that we see people using this situation to expand, say, business empires or expand their business operations. That may have been something that was happening at that time. The document obviously doesn't necessarily prove that, but it's something that we could look at. And yeah, I mean, those would be the main things that I would mention or that I would look for from that. Is there anything you would add?
No, I don't have anything to add other than I'm just going to break down what Dave did there so that, you as a student or you as a teacher can transfer this, right? So Dave took what he had analyzed, looking at the sort of title, the author, the audience, the purpose of this tourist document, and then he took the context, right? That he knows that from key concept 5.2, from period 5, that the French were in fact brutally dominating Vietnam at this time, to say, you know what, this guy who's saying that the Chinese are the true masters, he probably felt that way, but he's absolutely wrong, right? Okay,
yeah.
What does it tell us that he's wrong and he believes that the Chinese are true masters. Well, it tells us something about imperial paranoia during that time, that Europeans, despite being at the height of their power, recognized, correctly or not, that they were in a precarious position, right? And that they truly feared, through the lens of racism, often, right, the peoples they had subjugated.
Yeah, absolutely.
All that.
Man,
from
how long did that?
Hey,
how long did we go through that?
Dave, this document contains multitudes.
It does. Well, and it's
almost
incredible.
like history. You can figure stuff out, from just the little scraps that are left from the past, man.